Margaret Whitmore never imagined that at 73 years old, she would be sitting in a small studio apartment with nothing but a Bible, a notebook, and $17 to her name. The woman who had once owned a successful bakery in Charleston and South Carolina, who had raised 3 children and buried a faithful husband, now found herself staring at an eviction notice taped to her door. December 31st, 2023, the last day of the year. And possibly, she thought, the last day of her dignity. But this is not a story about loss. This is a story about what happens when faith meets financial wisdom, when desperation becomes discipleship, and when one elderly woman's obedience to God's principles created a ripple effect that would transform an entire community. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about money, faith, and the season of life we call too late. Margaret's journey to that studio apartment had been swift and brutal. After her husband Thomas died 2 years earlier, she discovered that their finances were not what she had believed. Medical bills had consumed their savings. The bakery, which had been struggling since the pandemic, finally closed its doors. Her children, well-meaning but stretched thin with their own families across different states, could offer only limited help. Pride kept Margaret from asking for more, and a series of poor financial decisions, co-signing a loan for a friend who defaulted, investing in a scheme that promised quick returns, ignoring the mounting credit card debt, had done the rest. Let me tell you more about how it all unraveled. Thomas had been sick for 18 months before he passed. Cancer, the kind that starts quietly and spreads quickly. They had insurance, but insurance doesn't cover everything. There were experimental treatments not covered by their plan. There were trips to specialists in Atlanta and Durham. There were weeks when Margaret closed the bakery to be by his side during chemotherapy. She would have done it all again, every cent spent, every day closed, every sacrifice made, because that's what love does. That's what 51 years of marriage means. But love doesn't protect you from the financial consequences of those choices. The bakery had been their dream, built from scratch in 1993. Whitmore's Daily Bread, it was called, a play on the Lord's Prayer that Thomas had suggested. It occupied a corner spot on King Street, with big windows that let the morning light pour in and let passers-by see the bread rising, the cakes being frosted, the cookies coming out of the oven. For nearly 3 decades, it had been a gathering place. Birthday cakes for generations of Charleston families, wedding cakes that became family legends, daily bread that people drove across town for. Margaret knew her customers by name, knew their children's names, knew their celebrations and their sorrows. But the world changed. First came the big chain bakeries with their cheaper prices and longer hours. Then came the pandemic, which shut down small businesses for months and changed consumer habits forever. People ordered online now, bought from grocery stores, made do with less. When the bakery reopened, the foot traffic never fully returned. Margaret tried to adapt. She started a website, or rather, her daughter tried to help her start one, but Margaret could never quite figure out how to update it. She attempted delivery services, but the apps took such a large percentage that she barely broke even. She raised prices to cover rising costs and lost more customers. She lowered prices to compete and couldn't cover her overhead. By the time Thomas died, the bakery was hemorrhaging money. Margaret kept it open for 6 more months, pouring in what little savings they had left, taking out a small business loan she had no realistic way of repaying, hoping for a miracle that didn't come. The day she locked the doors for the final time, she sat in the empty shop and wept, not just for the business, but for the dream, for the life she and Thomas had built. And hey, I'd love to know, where are you watching this from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Let's see how far this message travels as we close out this year together. Margaret opened her Bible that morning, not out of habit, but out of desperation. She had been reading through Proverbs, and one chapter per day corresponding to the date. December 31st meant Proverbs 31. Her eyes fell on verses 16 through 18. She considereth a field and buyeth it. With the fruit of her hands she planteth a vineyard. She girdeth her loins with strength, and strengtheneth her arms. She perceiveth that her merchandise is good. Her candle goeth not out by night. The Proverbs 31 woman. Margaret had read this passage hundreds of times, had even taught Bible studies on it years ago. But today, something was different. She wasn't reading about an idealized ancient woman. She was reading a financial blueprint. This woman considered before she bought. She worked with her hands. She perceived, discerned, for the identity she had carried that her merchandise was good. Margaret wasn't lazy, baker, but neither was she foolish. Pillar of the community. She was strategic. The Reformed Presbyterian Church she had attended for 40 years, she read the entire chapter again, and a few months of rent. Verse 13. But Margaret could see the strain. She seeketh wool and flax and worketh willingly with her hands. The church was small, the congregation aging. She perceiveth that her merchandise is good. Her candle goeth not out by night. So here she was. On the last day of the year, hand to the poor, wondering if God had forgotten her name. She reacheth forth her hands. The eviction notice gave her 30 days. Verse 27. After that, she looketh well to the ways of her household, 73 years old and homeless. The bread of idleness. The thought made her physically ill. This woman was not just a homemaker. She had called her children the week before. She was an entrepreneur, trying to keep her voice steady, a producer, a giver, desperate. She created value. Her oldest, David, she managed resources. Was a teacher in Colorado. She served others, 4 kids of his own, and she did it all with wisdom, sent what he could, strength, and dignity. But she could hear the worry in his voice about something stir inside her. Her middle child, Rebecca, was going through a divorce in California. She had been sitting in self-pity for months, herself afloat, paralyzed by youngest and fear, offered to let her move in with his family. She had been eating the bread of idleness, not because she was lazy, his wife had never really, but because she had lost hope, and the thought of being in Proverbs didn't wait for someone else's home to be perfect. Felt worse. She worked with what she had, so she had Margaret picked up her note, telling Michael she had something in the works. At the top of the page, she wrote, "She had nothing. What I know, no prospects. It seemed like a foolish exercise. No hope." What did just a 73-year-old broke woman know? An eviction notice. But as she began to write, and a crushing weight of shame inside made it hard to breathe. She knew how to bake. If you've ever felt years of muscle memory, if you've ever wondered whether God sees your financial struggle, of yeast and gluten development, because what happened how to next in flavor from simple ingredients might just be the answer. She knew which recipes were crowd pleasers and which ones were special occasion showstoppers. She knew how to make bread that made people close their eyes and sigh with satisfaction. She knew her community, every family, every struggle, every celebration. She had baked for 3 generations of some families. She knew who was getting married, who was having babies, who was sick, who was celebrating milestones. She knew the rhythms of Charleston, the tourist seasons, the local events, the church calendars. She knew the Bible, decades of study and teaching. She had led women's Bible studies for 25 years. She had taught Sunday school. She had counseled young wives and mothers. She had prayed with people in hospital rooms and funeral homes. She knew Scripture, not just as academic knowledge, but as lived wisdom. And she knew what it meant to steward resources carefully, even if she had forgotten that lesson in her grief. Growing up in the 60s and 70s, the daughter of a factory worker and a seamstress, Margaret had learned to make much from little. She could stretch a dollar. She could repurpose and reuse. She could find creative solutions to practical problems. Those skills hadn't disappeared. They had just been buried under loss and discouragement. Then she wrote, "What I have. $17. A working oven in her studio apartment. Her grandmother's recipe box, a battered metal container filled with handwritten cards, some dating back to the 1930s. A smartphone her daughter had given her last Christmas that she barely knew how to use. A small following on the church's social media page where she had occasionally posted encouragement. Basic baking tools, her mixing bowls, her wooden spoons, her measuring cups. They had survived the liquidation of the bakery because they were personal items, not business assets. She also had something else, though it seemed almost silly to write down, her grandmother's sourdough starter. It was nearly 100 years old, passed down from her grandmother to her mother to her. Margaret had kept it alive through everything. The move from the bakery, the financial collapse, the depression. Every week she had fed it flour and water, maintaining this living connection to her past. Some mornings, it was the only thing that got her out of bed, the knowledge that something depended on her, that she was keeping something alive. Finally, she wrote, "What they need." She thought about her community, young mothers overwhelmed and exhausted, trying to provide healthy meals on tight budgets while working full-time, college students at the nearby university surviving on ramen and cheap pizza, homesick and hungry for something that tasted like home, elderly neighbors eating alone, opening cans of soup in empty apartments, longing for the comfort of fresh bread and human connection. The homeless shelter 3 blocks away that served meals to 50 people every evening, the same 50 souls who needed to know they mattered, that someone cared enough to create something beautiful for them. People needed more than food. They needed connection, dignity, hope. They needed to know someone cared enough to create something beautiful for them. They needed to taste grace in tangible form. They needed reminders that God provides, that He satisfies it, that He is the bread of life who fills every hungry soul. Margaret looked at her list and felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Possibility, not certainty, that would come later, but the whisper of divine possibility. She remembered Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6. "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct thy paths." She bowed her head right there at her tiny kitchen table and prayed a prayer of surrender. Not the kind of prayer that begs God to fix everything magically, not the kind that makes demands or sets conditions, but the kind that says, "I will obey whatever you show me, even if it seems small, even if it seems foolish, even if I can't see the end from the beginning." She prayed, "Lord, I have $17 and a whole lot of failure. I have skills and recipes and a lifetime of knowledge that feels useless right now, but if you can use it, it's yours. Show me what to do. Direct my path. I'll take the first step if you'll light the way." And if you're praying that kind of prayer today, if you're ready for God to direct your path into this new year, type "Direct my path" in the comments. Let's step into 2026 together with that declaration. Margaret took her $17 to the discount grocery store 6 blocks from her apartment. She walked because she couldn't afford the bus fare. It was cold for Charleston, maybe 45 degrees, and she wrapped her threadbare coat tighter as she walked. In the store, she calculated carefully: flour, 5 pounds for $3, sugar, $2, eggs, $2.50 for a dozen, butter, $4 on sale, yeast, $2 for a jar. That left her with $3.50. She stood in the aisle for a long time, doing math in her head, trying to figure out if she had enough. She put the butter back and grabbed the store-brand margarine instead. That saved her $1.50. She walked to the register with her humble basket, paid, and walked home with a bag in each arm and 50 cents in her pocket. Back in her apartment, Margaret cleared her small kitchen counter and got to work. She fed her sourdough starter, watching it bubble and come to life. While it activated, she prepared her other ingredients. She had decided to make 6 loaves. That was the maximum her oven could handle in 2 rounds. She mixed and kneaded, losing herself in the familiar rhythm. Her hands remembered what her mind sometimes forgot, that she was good at this, that she had value to offer, that she could create something beautiful from simple ingredients. The physical work felt good. It had been months since she had baked anything beyond a simple biscuit for herself. Her muscles protested at first, her shoulders aching, her arthritic hands cramping, but she pushed through. "She girdeth her loins with strength, and strengtheneth her arms," she quoted to herself. This was more than baking. This was an act of faith. This was her alabaster box, broken and poured out in worship. As the dough rose, Margaret sat at her table and thought about what to charge. She needed to cover her costs and have money to reinvest. She did the math. Her ingredients had cost $14. 6 loaves meant roughly $2.33 per loaf in materials. But what was her labor worth? What was 50 years of expertise worth? What was bread baked with prayer worth? She thought about the grocery store, where a decent artisan loaf sold for $6 or $7. She could charge that. She probably should charge that. But something stopped her. She remembered the Proverbs 31 woman again. She stretcheth out her hand to the poor. This couldn't be just about profit. It had to be about service, about stewardship, about pointing people to the ultimate bread of life. $5 per loaf. That's what she would charge. It was affordable enough for people to say yes, but high enough to sustain the work. And she would donate all the profits, not just tithe 10%, but give everything beyond her costs to the Charleston Community Shelter. This had to be bigger than her own survival. It had to be about the kingdom. By evening, she had 6 beautiful, crusty, aromatic loaves cooling on her counter. The apartment smelled like heaven. Margaret hadn't realized how much she had missed that smell. The smell of yeast and warmth and transformation, of simple ingredients becoming something greater than the sum of their parts. She stood there for a moment, just breathing it in, thanking God for the gift of this moment, for the reminder that she still had something to offer. Then came the hard part, the photograph. Margaret stared at her smartphone like it was an alien device. She had never been good with technology. Thomas had handled the bakery's website and social media. Her children had tried to teach her, but she always felt stupid and frustrated. But tonight, she had no choice. She had to figure this out. She arranged the loaves on her counter, trying different angles. Too dark, too shadowy, too far away. She moved to the window where the evening light was softer. Better. She took 20 photos, deleting 19 of them. The one she kept wasn't perfect. The lighting was uneven, the composition amateur, but it was honest. You could see the golden crust, the rustic beauty, the care that had gone into the creation. Now for the post. Margaret opened the church's social media page. She was one of the administrators because she occasionally posted prayer requests and encouragement. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. What should she say? How do you ask for help without sounding desperate? How do you offer something without sounding salesy? She closed her eyes and prayed for words. Then she typed, fresh sourdough bread, baked with prayer, $5 per loaf. All proceeds go to Charleston Community Shelter, message to order. She paused, then added, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. Matthew 4, verse 4. She read it 3 times, her finger hovering over the post button. This was it. This was her stepping out in faith. This was her considering the field and buying it, perceiving that her merchandise was good. She pressed post and then immediately closed the app, afraid to watch, afraid of the silence, afraid of the rejection. Margaret expected nothing, maybe one order from a sympathetic church member, maybe none. She went to bed that night with a knot in her stomach, praying, Lord, I did what you showed me. The rest is up to you. She woke at 5:30 in the morning, old baker's habits die hard, and lay in bed for a few minutes before reaching for her phone. 43 notifications. Her heart started pounding. 43? That couldn't be right. She must have done something wrong with the settings. But no. 43 messages. 43 orders. People weren't just buying bread. They were buying hope. They were buying the story of a woman who refused to quit. They were buying something made with love and prayer by someone who knew what it meant to be broken. Margaret sat up in bed and started to cry. Not tears of sadness this time, but tears of overwhelming gratitude and shock. God had answered. Not just answered, exceeded. She read through the messages. Some were from church members she expected, but others were from people she didn't know, friends of friends who had seen the post shared, and the messages weren't just orders. They were encouragements. I've been praying for you, Margaret. I'm so glad to see you baking again. This bread is going to be a blessing. I can't wait to taste something made with prayer. But here's where Margaret's Reformed theology kicked in, that doctrine of stewardship, of faithfulness in small things, of honest work as worship. She didn't see this as her big break to get rich. She saw it as a responsibility. She couldn't fulfill 43 orders. She had ingredients for 6 loaves, an oven that could only bake 3 at a time, and a 73-year-old body that could only do so much. She had 50 cents to her name. She couldn't buy more ingredients until she collected payment from the first batch. She posted a message. "I am overwhelmed by your response and your kindness. I can only bake 12 loaves per day with my small oven. First 12 orders will be fulfilled today and tomorrow. I'll open orders again in 3 days. Thank you for your patience and support." Some might say this was bad business. Capitalize on the demand. Raise your prices. Bake all night. Scale up quickly. But Margaret understood something that most people miss. Sustainable growth requires wisdom, and wisdom requires limits. Proverbs 21:12 verse 5 says, "The thoughts of the diligent tend only to plenteousness, but of everyone that is hasty only to want." She had seen businesses, including her own bakery, fail because they grew too fast, overpromised and underdelivered, sacrificed quality for quantity. She would not make that mistake again. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret baked bread, 12 loaves every 3 days, working within her constraints. She developed a system. She would take orders on Monday, bake on Tuesday and Wednesday, deliver on Thursday and Friday. Saturday was her day of rest, biblical principle, not negotiable. Sunday was for worship, then the cycle would start again. Each loaf sold for $5. After costs, she cleared about $30 per batch. All of it went to the shelter, except for enough to buy ingredients for the next round. She was not making money yet. She was building something. But with each loaf, she included something extra, a small card with a verse and a short reflection on faith and finances. She wrote them by hand, spending hours at her kitchen table with a pen and index cards. She wrote about contentment, quoting Philippians 4 verse 11. "I have learned, in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content." She wrote about the difference between poverty and simplicity, explaining that poverty is involuntary lack, but simplicity is voluntary limitation, choosing to live with less so you can give more and worry less. She wrote about how debt steals our freedom and our peace, quoting Proverbs 22 verse 7. "The borrower is servant to the lender." She shared her own story, not in detail, but enough to be honest. "I know what it's like to owe money you cannot pay. I know the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, the shame. But I also know that God is a God of second chances, and that debt doesn't define you." She wrote about giving even when you have little, pointing to the widow's mite in Mark 12, verses 42 through 44. She gave 2 mites, which was all she had. God doesn't ask for what you don't have. He asks for faithfulness with what you do have. She wrote about the danger of comparing your life to others, of measuring your worth by your net worth. She wrote about trusting God's timing, about how delay is not denial. She wrote about work as worship, about how every honest job done with excellence is an offering to God. She wrote about the trap of consumerism, of buying things you don't need with money. You don't have to impress people you don't like. She wrote about the freedom that comes from living below your means, from owing no one anything, from being content with enough. Before you think this is just a nice story about an old lady baking bread, let me tell you what started happening. People weren't just buying bread. They were reading those cards, and they were learning. The first person to reach out was a young single mother named Tasha. She was 28 years old, working 2 jobs, barely keeping her head above water. She messaged Margaret after buying bread for 3 weeks in a row. "I've been eating your bread and reading your cards. I just made my first budget, ever. I'm 28 years old, and I never learned this stuff. Nobody ever taught me. Can you teach me more?" Margaret stared at that message for a long time. She had never thought of herself as a teacher of financial principles. She was just a baker who read her Bible. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she did know things. She knew the Bible, and the Bible has more verses about money than about heaven and hell combined. More verses about money than about prayer. God clearly thinks our finances matter, and she knew real life. She had made mistakes, big ones, but she had also done things right for decades before everything fell apart. Maybe she had something to offer. She messaged Tasha back. "I would be happy to sit with you and talk. Let's meet at Corner Coffee on King Street, Wednesday at 10, my treat." That last part was bold, considering she had less than $5 in her pocket, but she believed God would provide, and he did. Someone ordered an extra loaf that week specifically to tip Margaret, leaving her $10. She used half of it for the coffee meeting. Wednesday came. Margaret arrived early, nervous. She ordered 2 coffees, black for her. She didn't know what Tasha liked, so she asked the barista to recommend something popular. She sat at a corner table with her worn Bible and a yellow legal pad. Tasha arrived 10 minutes late, apologetic, frazzled. She had 2 children, a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and had just dropped them at daycare. She worked at a call center during the day and cleaned offices 3 nights a week. She was exhausted, broke, and desperate for help. "I don't even know where to start," Tasha said, fighting back tears. "I make okay money, I guess, but it's never enough. I'm always behind. I have credit card debt I can barely pay the minimum on. My car is breaking down. My rent just went up. I feel like I'm drowning." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Tasha's hand. "You're not drowning. You're here. You're asking for help. That takes courage. Let's start with what you know. Do you know how much money you make each month?" Tasha nodded. "About $2,800 after taxes." "Good. Do you know how much you spend?" Tasha's face fell. "More than that." "Okay. So that's our starting point. We need to figure out where every dollar is going. Because if you don't tell your money where to go, it will disappear and you'll never know where it went." Over the next 2 hours, using nothing but her Bible, a napkin, and simple addition and subtraction, Margaret taught Tasha basic principles. They made a list of every expense: rent, utilities, groceries, gas, daycare, minimum debt payments, everything. The total was $3,200. Tasha was spending $400 more per month than she made. The deficit was being covered by credit cards, which meant the problem was getting worse, not better. "No wonder you feel like you're drowning," Margaret said gently. "You are drowning. But here's the good news. We know the problem, and we can fix it. But it's going to require some hard choices." They went through the expenses line by line. Groceries, $400 a month. "That's high for 1 adult and 2 small children," Margaret observed. "Farga, I bet you're buying prepared foods because you're exhausted and don't have time to cook, but you're paying 3 times as much for convenience." Subscriptions, streaming services, music apps, monthly boxes, totaling $80. Do you watch all of these? Do you use all of these? Tasha admitted she didn't. Phone bill, $120 for an unlimited plan. Do you need unlimited? Could you use Wi-Fi more and data less? They found $200 in cuts without touching the essentials. Margaret showed Tasha how to meal plan, how to cook simple meals in bulk, how to use a crock pot so dinner was ready when she got home. She shared recipes, shopping lists, strategies. Another $100 saved. They were still $100 short away, but it was progress. Then Margaret asked the hard question, "What about your debt? How much do you owe?" Tasha pulled out her phone and showed Margaret her credit card balances. $6,000 on one card at 22% interest, $4,000 on another at 19%. Margaret did the math. Tasha was paying about $200 per month just in interest. Money that was building nothing, buying nothing, going nowhere. "This is bondage," Margaret said, not unkindly. "The Bible says the borrower is servant to the lender. You're in servanthood. You're working for the credit card companies. We need to break that bondage." She explained the debt snowball method, paying minimums on everything except the smallest debt, attacking that one with every extra dollar until it's gone, then rolling that payment into the next debt. She explained how psychological wins matter more than mathematical optimization. She showed Tasha what life could look like in 18 months if she stayed focused. No credit card debt, breathing room in the budget, money saved for emergencies. "But the most important thing," Margaret said, pulling out her Bible, "is this. Philippians 4, verse 19. But my God shall supply all your need according to his riches in glory by Christ Jesus." Not all your wants, your needs. God promises to provide what you need. But he also calls us to be wise stewards. He feeds the birds, but he doesn't throw the food into their nests. They have to go get it. You have to do your part. Budget, work, save, cut expenses, pay off debt. And he'll do his part. Provide opportunities, open doors, give you strength, sustain you. Tasha wiped her eyes. "Nobody ever taught me this stuff. I grew up poor." My mum was terrible with money. I just repeated what I saw. I didn't know there was another way. Well, now you know, Margaret said with a smile. And now you can do differently. And someday you can teach someone else. They prayed together before leaving, right there in the coffee shop. Margaret prayed for God's provision in Tasha's life, for wisdom and discipline, for hope and endurance. When they stood to leave, Tasha hugged Margaret tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Joichu, you have no idea what this means to me." But Margaret did know because someone had done the same for her once, decades ago, and now it was her turn to pass it on. Tasha went home and implemented what she learned. She cancelled subscriptions. She changed her phone plan. She started meal planning and cooking. She stopped using credit cards. She set up automatic transfers so that every payday, money went to savings first, then to debt, then to living expenses. It wasn't easy. There were moments of frustration, of wanting to give up, of feeling deprived, but every week she saw progress, small progress, but progress nonetheless. Within a month, she had paid off her smaller credit card completely, $4,000 down, $6,000 to go. She called Margaret, ecstatic. "It's gone. My first credit card is paid off. I did it." Margaret celebrated with her. "That's wonderful. Now take that payment you were making on that card and add it to what you're paying on the other one. You're going to attack that debt like a warrior." And Tasha did. She told her sister about what she was learning. Her sister told her co-worker. The co-worker told her Bible study group. And suddenly, Margaret had 5 women sitting in her studio apartment one Thursday evening, all wanting to learn what Tasha had learned. If you're realizing right now that maybe you need to learn some of these principles too, hit that subscribe button. This is exactly the kind of content we're going to keep sharing in 2026. Real stories, biblical truth, practical wisdom. Don't miss what's coming. That first Thursday night gathering was makeshift and awkward. Margaret didn't have enough chairs, so some women sat on the floor. She didn't have a curriculum prepared, just her Bible and her experience. She started by sharing her own story, the whole story this time. The success of the bakery, the illness and death of her husband, the financial collapse, the eviction notice, the $17 and the decision to bake bread. She didn't hide her shame or her mistakes. She was honest about the bad decisions she had made, the pride that had kept her from asking for help sooner, the grief that had clouded her judgment. "I'm not standing here as someone who has it all figured out," Margaret told them. "I'm sitting here with you as someone who failed spectacularly and is learning to rebuild. But I'm learning to rebuild God's way, not the world's way. And that's what I want to share with you." She called her teaching kingdom economics. She hadn't invented the term, she'd heard it years ago at a conference, but she embraced it. It was the understanding that God's economy operates on different principles than the world's economy. The world says accumulate for yourself. God says give, and it shall be given unto you. The world says borrow your way to happiness. God says the borrower is servant to the lender. The world says you deserve it now. God says patience produces character and character produces hope. The world says money equals security. God says seek first the kingdom and all these things shall be added. The world says work to get rich. God says work as unto the Lord and be content with what you have. Over the weeks, Margaret developed a curriculum. Week 1. Understanding biblical stewardship. Everything belongs to God. We're just managers. Week 2. Creating a budget. Telling your money where to go instead of wondering where it went. Week 3. Escaping debt. The bondage of borrowing and the freedom of owing nothing. Week 4. Building savings, margin for emergencies and opportunities. Week 5. Wise giving, the privilege and practice of generosity. Week 6. Planning for the future, provision without presumption. But Margaret also taught something that surprised her students. God is not opposed to wealth. He's opposed to greed, to injustice, to trusting in riches rather than in Him. Abraham was wealthy. Job was wealthy. Solomon was wealthy. The Proverbs 31 woman was clearly prosperous. The issue is not having money. The issue is what has you. She quoted 1 Timothy 6 verse 10, "For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Not money itself. The love of money, the trust in money, the worship of money. God doesn't want you to be poor, Margaret explained. Poverty is not a virtue. Simplicity can be. Contentment is, but poverty, real poverty, steals dignity and limits generosity and creates constant stress. God wants you to have enough. He wants you to prosper so you can be generous, so you can provide for your family, so you can fund His kingdom work. But He wants you to hold it all loosely, to remember that He's the provider, and to be as willing to live with less as you are to steward more. Margaret taught her students to pray for 3 things regarding finances: provision, wisdom, and generosity. Not riches, not comfort, not ease, but provision, enough for today and trust for tomorrow. Wisdom, discernment about opportunities and discipline about temptations. Generosity, the ability to be a conduit of blessing rather than a container of hoarding. She taught them the biblical principle of first fruits, giving to God first before anything else. When you get paid, the first check you write should be to your church or to kingdom work, not because God needs your money, but because you need to remember where it comes from. You need to break the grip of materialism on your heart. You need to practice trust. She taught them about margin, living below your means so you have breathing room. If you spend everything you make, you're one emergency away from disaster. If you live on 90% and save 10%, you're building margin. You're building resilience. You're preparing for the unexpected. She taught them about delayed gratification, saving for what you want instead of borrowing for it. Our grandparents knew this. They saved for the car, the furniture, the vacation. They paid cash. They didn't have credit cards. We've been sold a lie that says you can have it now and pay later. But that's bondage. When you save first, you have freedom. When you borrow, you have payments. By March, the Thursday night group had grown to 15 women. They had outgrown Margaret's apartment and moved to the church. They met in the fellowship hall. Each woman brought a dish to share, and they ate together before the lesson. A potluck supper that built community and stretched grocery budgets. Margaret charged nothing. She simply taught what she knew, what the Bible said, what she had learned through her own financial collapse and reconstruction. And here's what happened: transformation, real, measurable, documented transformation. Women paid off thousands of dollars in debt. Women started emergency funds for the first time in their lives. Women left abusive relationships because they finally had financial independence. They weren't trapped by economic necessity. Women sent their kids to college without drowning in parent loans. Women retired with dignity instead of fear. Women started giving to their churches and communities in ways they never could before. Tasha paid off all her debt in 14 months, $10,000. She cried during class the night she made her final payment, holding up her phone to show a zero balance. The whole group celebrated with her, cheering and crying and praising God. And then Tasha did something remarkable. She immediately started saving the money she had been putting toward debt, $300 per month. Within 6 months, she had an emergency fund. Within a year, she had enough saved to move into a better apartment in a safer neighborhood. Her children had their own rooms for the first time. But the transformation wasn't just financial, it was spiritual. Because when you learn to handle money God's way, you're really learning to trust God's character. You're learning that He provides, that His timing is perfect, that obedience brings blessing, that faithfulness in small things leads to responsibility in larger things, that the love of money is the root of all evil, but the wise stewardship of money is a form of worship. Women in the class started praying differently. Not just God, give me money prayers, but God, give me wisdom prayers. Not just God, get me out of this mess prayers, but God, what are you trying to teach me through this prayers? They started seeing their financial struggles not as punishments, but as classrooms, not as evidence that God had abandoned them, but as opportunities to learn His ways and trust His faithfulness. Margaret's bread business grew too. Word spread. She could no longer keep up with demand, baking 12 loaves every 3 days, so she did something wise. She trained 2 other women from the church to bake using her recipes and her grandmother's starter. She divided the starter, Sourdough is a living thing, it can be split and shared, and taught them her techniques. She shared her suppliers, her methods, her quality standards. They formed a small cottage industry, properly registered and approved by local health regulations. They called themselves Whitmore's Daily Bread Collective. They baked in their home kitchens, meeting all the requirements for cottage food operations. They sold at the farmer's market every Saturday. They took special orders for weddings and events. And every loaf still came with a card, a verse, a thought, little seeds of wisdom tucked into a paper bag along with artisan bread. The business model was simple but sustainable. They charged $7 per loaf now. The demand justified the increase, and the quality warranted it. After ingredient costs and their time, they each made about $4 per loaf. They baked as much as they could without burning out. Margaret did about 15 loaves per week. Her partners did 20 each. Between the three of them, they produced about 55 loaves per week, revenue of $385. They each took home their share of the profit, about $80 per week for Margaret. Not much, but combined with her small Social Security check, it was enough. She could pay her rent, she could buy groceries. She was surviving, but they also committed to giving. 20% of all revenue went to three places: the Charleston Community Shelter, the church's Benevolence Fund, and a scholarship program for young people in the community who wanted to learn a trade or start a business. They tracked every penny, kept clean books, operated with integrity. This wasn't just a business, it was a ministry, and they stewarded it as such. By June, Margaret had moved into a modest two-bedroom apartment. Not fancy, but sufficient. One bedroom was hers, simply furnished with a bed, a dresser, and a reading chair by the window. The other became her office, a place where she could write, prepare lessons, and meet with women who needed counsel. She had a desk, bookshelves for her Bible commentaries and financial resources, and two comfortable chairs for conversations. She had enough. Not excess, but enough. And she had learned that enough, when it comes with peace and purpose, is the greatest wealth of all. Her children noticed the change. David called one Sunday afternoon, and Margaret could hear the surprise in his voice. "Mom, you sound happy, like really happy. Not fake happy. What's going on?" Margaret laughed. "I am happy, sweetheart. I'm doing what I was made to do. I'm baking, I'm teaching, I'm serving. I don't have much money, but I have enough. And I have purpose. For the first time in a long time, I'm not just surviving, I'm thriving." Rebecca visited in July, flying in from California for a long weekend. She walked into Margaret's apartment and stopped in the doorway. "Mom, this place, it feels like home. Your studio felt like a prison cell, but this feels like you." They spent the weekend together, talking and cooking and laughing. Rebecca attended the Thursday night class and was amazed at what her mother had built. "Mom, you're teaching financial literacy to dozens of women. Do you realize how important this is? These women are learning things they never learned in school, things that will change their entire lives and their children's lives. You're breaking generational cycles of poverty and debt. This is incredible." Margaret shrugged, embarrassed by the praise. "I'm just teaching what I know, what the Bible says." "No," Rebecca said firmly. "You're doing more than that. You're giving these women hope. You're showing them a way forward. You're proving that it's never too late to start over. If this story is speaking to you, if you're feeling that tug in your spirit that maybe God wants to do something new in your finances this coming year, would you do me a favor? Just hit that like button. It helps this message reach more people who need to hear it. And honestly, it encourages me to keep sharing these stories that matter. But the most remarkable transformation was Margaret herself. The woman who had been consumed by shame, who had felt useless and forgotten, now walked with purpose and dignity. She no longer avoided eye contact at the grocery store, afraid of running into people who knew about her bankruptcy. She no longer made excuses about why she lived in a small apartment instead of her former home. She no longer defined herself by her losses. She understood that her financial collapse had not been the end of her story. It had been the beginning of her true ministry. God had to strip away everything she was trusting in, her savings, her business, her reputation, her security. so that she would finally trust in him alone, not as a concept, but as a reality, not as theology, but as lived experience. She often quoted 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." Her weakness had become the platform for God's strength. Her failure had become the foundation for His glory. Her brokenness had become the bridge for others' healing. The very thing she had been most ashamed of, her bankruptcy, her eviction, her financial ignorance in grief, had become her greatest ministry tools. Because when she stood in front of a room full of struggling women and said, "I've been where you are. I know what it's like to have $17 and no plan. I know what it's like to feel like a failure. But I also know that God is faithful, and I'm living proof that He can turn your mess into your message." They believed her, because she wasn't speaking theory. She was speaking testimony. One evening in September, Pastor Davidson visited Margaret in her apartment. He called ahead, asking if he could stop by after the evening service. Margaret tidied up, made tea, wondered what was wrong. Had someone complained about her classes? Was she overstepping by teaching at the church? She prayed for peace as she waited. Pastor Davidson arrived with his wife, L&D, which immediately made Margaret feel better. If it was serious discipline, he wouldn't bring his wife. They sat in her small living room, and the pastor had an expression Margaret couldn't quite read, serious but not angry, thoughtful but not worried. "Margaret," he began, "Ellen and I have been watching what God is doing through you, the bread ministry, the Thursday classes, the women whose lives are being transformed. It's remarkable. It's exactly what the church should be doing, teaching people biblical wisdom, meeting practical needs, building community." Margaret nodded, still unsure where this was going. Pastor Davidson reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This came to the church office yesterday. It's addressed to you." He handed it to her. Margaret opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a check made out to her personally, $10,000. $10,000, she gasped. There was also a note, typed on plain paper. "Dear Margaret, I attended one of your Thursday evening classes through a friend who invited me. I am not a member of your church, and I prefer to remain anonymous. But I wanted you to know that your teaching has transformed my life. I was 62 years old, still in debt, with no retirement savings, terrified of my future. Through your class, I learned to budget, paid off my debt, and started saving. I now have hope. I am writing this check as a seed investment in whatever God is calling you to do next. Use it wisely. Use it for His kingdom. Use it to help others the way you helped me. With deep gratitude, a grateful student." Margaret stared at the check. $10,000. A year ago, this amount would have solved all her immediate problems, paid her rent, covered her bills, bought her time. Now it represented something different: expansion, multiplication, kingdom investment. She looked up at Pastor Davidson with tears in her eyes. "Who is this from, do you know?" He shook his head. "I have no idea. It was in the church mail, addressed to me with a note asking me to deliver it to you. The check is cashable. I verified with the bank. Beyond that, I know nothing." Margaret held the check, overwhelmed. "What do I do with this?" Pastor Davidson smiled. "That's between you and the Lord, but I'd suggest you pray over it and ask for wisdom." Ellen spoke up for the first time. "Margaret, you've been faithful with little. God is trusting you with more." That's how His kingdom works. They prayed together before leaving, thanking God for His provision, asking for wisdom, committing the gift to His purposes. After they left, Margaret sat alone in her apartment with the check in her hands. She prayed for 3 days, asking God for wisdom, waiting for direction, refusing to rush into a decision. And the answer came, not as a voice from heaven, but as a conviction growing stronger each day: start a micro-enterprise fund. The concept was simple but powerful. She would loan small amounts, $500 to $2,000, to women in her community who wanted to start businesses but had no access to capital. No bank would loan them money. They had bad credit, no collateral, no business experience. They were trapped in a cycle of poverty with no way out. But with a small loan, training, and support, they could start something. They could change their trajectory. They could build a different future. The loans would be interest-free. Lending with interest to the poor is forbidden in Scripture, but they would require accountability. Each woman would attend a 6-week course on biblical financial principles before receiving her loan. She would submit a business plan. She would meet monthly with a mentor. And when she paid back her loan, that money would go to fund the next woman's dream. The gift of $10,000 could fund 5 women initially, and as they paid back their loans, it could fund 5 more, then 10, then 20. The impact would multiply exponentially. Margaret called it the Proverbs Fund, after the wise woman in Proverbs 31 who considered a field and bought it, who perceived that her merchandise was good. She set up a separate bank account, established guidelines and applications, recruited volunteers to serve as mentors, and prayed for wisdom at every step. She wasn't a banker, she wasn't a business expert, but she knew the Bible, she knew her community, and she knew that God uses the foolish things to shame the wise. The first loan went to a woman named Teresa. She was 37 years old, a former addict, now 2 years sober, living in a halfway house and working minimum wage at a fast food restaurant. She had a teenage son, Jordan, who had been raised mostly by his grandmother, while Teresa was in and out of jail and rehab. Now clean and desperate to rebuild her life, Teresa had a dream: start a lawn care service with her son. They would cut grass, trim hedges, do basic landscaping. Jordan was strong and willing. Teresa was determined and newly skilled. She had learned about lawn equipment and landscaping through a re-entry program. What they didn't have was money for equipment. Teresa applied for a loan through the Proverbs Fund. She attended all 6 weeks of the financial literacy class. She submitted a business plan, simple pass but thorough. She showed projections, identified target customers, outlined a marketing strategy. Margaret and the other mentors reviewed her application and approved a loan of $1,500. Teresa bought a used riding mower, a weed trimmer, basic tools, and business insurance. She named the business Second Chance Lawn Service. Within a month, Teresa and Jordan had 10 regular customers. Within 3 months, they had 25. They worked every afternoon after school and all day Saturday. Teresa quit her minimum wage job and worked the business full-time. Jordan earned money for college. They paid back their loan in 10 months, ahead of schedule. But more than a business was built. A relationship was rebuilt. A mother and son were working side by side, building something together, learning trust and partnership. Teresa stood in front of the Thursday class one evening and testified with tears, "I spent 15 years of my life high, in jail, or homeless. I was a terrible mother. I abandoned my son. But God gave me a second chance, and Miss Margaret gave me the means to build something. We're not just cutting grass, we're building a legacy." The second loan went to Maria, a 42-year-old immigrant from Mexico with limited English. She had cleaned houses for 20 years, always working for someone else, always paid in cash, always invisible, but Maria could cook. She made authentic Mexican food that made people close their eyes and sigh. Tamales, hies, mole, pozole, fresh tortillas. People who tasted her cooking always said the same thing: "You should sell this." But Maria had no money, no credit, no business knowledge. The Proverbs Fund loaned her $1,200. She bought a food handler's permit, commercial-grade cookware, and ingredients. She started catering small events, quinceañeras, birthday parties, church gatherings. Word spread. Within 6 months, Maria was catering 3 events per week. She employed 3 other women from her church, immigrants like her who needed work and dignity. She paid back her loan in full, and she showed up at church one Sunday with a check for $500 for the Benevolence Fund. "God blessed me," she said in halting English. "Now I bless others." The third loan went to Lynette, a 60-year-old woman who had never worked outside the home. She had married young, raised 5 children, and devoted her life to her family. Her husband died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving her with a mortgage and no income. Her children helped what they could, but they had their own families. Lynette was desperate but had no job skills, no resume, no confidence. What she did have was decades of helping her children with homework. She had tutored kids in her neighborhood for years, unpaid, just out of love. Margaret saw potential. The Proverbs Fund loaned Lynette $800 to start a tutoring center. She rented space at the church 2 afternoons per week. She advertised at local schools. Within 2 months, she had 15 students, kids struggling in math and reading, kids from low-income families whose parents couldn't afford expensive tutoring centers. Lynette charged $20 per hour, affordable but fair. She was making $1,200 per month. It wasn't wealth, but combined with her social security, it was enough. More importantly, she had discovered gifts she never knew she had. She was good at this. She was making a difference in children's lives. At 60 years old, she had found a calling. By the end of 2024, the Proverbs Fund had helped launch 12 businesses: a cleaning service, a catering company, 3 home-based childcare centers, a graphic design business, a lawn care service, 2 food trucks, a tutoring center, a handmade jewelry business, and a mobile car detailing service. 12 women who had been stuck, trapped, hopeless, now business owners, income earners, hope builders. But more than businesses were launched. Lives were transformed, families were changed, communities were blessed. Each woman who received a loan also became a teacher, sharing what she had learned with others. The ripple effect was exponential. Teresa hired 2 other men from her recovery program. Maria taught her employees not just cooking, but budgeting and saving. Lynette tutored students for free when families couldn't afford to pay. The kingdom was advancing, one transformed life at a time. And each of these women learned the same principles Margaret had learned: start small, steward faithfully, give generously, trust completely, work as unto the Lord, honor God with your finances, hold everything loosely, remember that He is the provider and you are the manager. Live below your means, save for the future, invest in people, build margin, break the bondage of debt, practice contentment, pursue faithfulness over success, and trust that God's ways are better than your ways, especially when, they require sacrifice and patience. By the end of 2025, over 100 women had directly participated in Margaret's classes or businesses, and those women had influenced their families, their churches, their neighborhoods. Husbands were learning from wives who attended the classes. Teenagers were learning from mothers who practiced what Margaret taught. Churches were implementing financial literacy programs based on Margaret's curriculum. The transformation was spreading like leaven through dough, slow but thorough, invisible but inevitable. Now, I want you to think about something. Where were you 1 year ago? What has changed? What hasn't changed? And what do you want to be different 1 year from now? Drop a comment and let me know. Because the truth is, transformation doesn't happen by accident. It happens when we combine faith with action, prayer with planning, trust with hard work. The local news picked up Margaret's story in November. A reporter named Jessica Chen heard about the Proverbs Fund from a friend whose sister had received a loan. She contacted Margaret, asking if she could interview her and some of the women who had been helped. Margaret was hesitant. She didn't want attention or credit. But Pastor Davidson encouraged her. "Margaret, this isn't about you, it's about what God is doing. And if telling your story encourages even one more person, it's worth it." So Margaret agreed. The news crew came to her apartment, to the Thursday night class, to Teresa's house where they filmed her and Jordan loading equipment into their truck, to Maria's kitchen where she was making tamales for an upcoming event. They interviewed Margaret, asking about her journey from bankruptcy to this thriving ministry. They interviewed women whose lives had been changed. They highlighted the Proverbs Fund and showed how it worked. The segment aired on a Tuesday evening. They titled it, "73-Year-Old Woman Goes from Broke to Breaking Barriers." It was a 5-minute feature on the evening news, professionally produced, emotionally compelling. The reporter asked Margaret what she would say to people who feel like it's too late for them, who think they're too old, or too broken, or too far behind. Margaret looked directly into the camera and said something that would be shared thousands of times across social media. She said, "It's never too late for God to write a new chapter in your story, but you have to be willing to let Him hold the pen, and you have to be willing to start where you are with what you have." The widow in 2 Kings chapter 4 had nothing but a little oil. The boy in John chapter 6 had nothing but 5 loaves and 2 fish. The Proverbs 31 woman started by considering 1 field. God doesn't need you to have much. He needs you to be faithful with what you do have, whether you're 23 or 73, whether you have $17 or 17,000, whether you're just starting out or starting over. God can use you. He can transform you. He can take your mess and turn it into a message, your test and turn it into a testimony. But you have to trust Him, and you have to start. The clip went viral. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed 50,000 times on the news station's website. Within a week, it had been shared across Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube hundreds of thousands of times. Margaret received messages from all over the country, people thanking her, people asking for advice, people sharing their own stories of late-life transformation. Churches invited her to speak. Women's conferences requested her presence. A publisher contacted her about writing a book. Organizations dedicated to financial literacy wanted to partner with her. Margaret was overwhelmed. She sat in her apartment, staring at her email inbox full of requests, feeling the weight of unexpected responsibility. She prayed, "Lord, I'm just a 73-year-old woman who bakes bread and teaches a Bible study. I don't know how to handle all this." And in the quiet of her heart, she sensed God's response. "You don't have to handle it all. Just do the next right thing." So she did. She responded to a few emails. She accepted a few speaking invitations, local ones, places she could drive to in a day. She declined the book deal, at least for now. She referred organizations to her curriculum and offered to share her materials freely. She remained grounded. She remembered the eviction notice, the $17, the shame and fear. She remembered how God had met her in that low place and taught her His ways. She didn't want fame or platform for its own sake. She wanted impact. She wanted transformation. She wanted to see lives changed and God glorified. By December 2025, exactly 2 years after that desperate morning in her studio apartment, Margaret gathered her original Thursday night group for a special meeting. They met at the church in the same fellowship hall where they had started. There were now 35 women present, the original 15 plus 20 more who had joined throughout the year. Margaret had asked them to come prepared to share one way their life had changed since joining the class. The testimonies lasted for 2 hours. Tasha shared that she had just been promoted at her job and had saved $5,000. Another woman, Keisha, shared that she had left an abusive marriage because she finally had financial independence. She wasn't trapped by economic necessity anymore. A woman named Linda shared that she had tithed for the first time in her life and experienced the joy of generous giving. A woman named Patricia shared that she had taught her teenage daughters how to budget, breaking the cycle of financial ignorance in her family. One by one, women stood and shared. Debt paid off, tens of thousands of dollars collectively, businesses started, relationships healed, churches blessed through increased giving, children educated, futures secured, hope restored. Faith deepened. Margaret stood before them and did something unexpected. She cried, not tears of sadness, but tears of overwhelming gratitude. She looked at these women, women of different ages, races, backgrounds, and circumstances, and saw what God had done. Every single one of them had been transformed in some way. Not perfected, they still struggled, still made mistakes, still faced challenges, but transformed, moving forward instead of backward, building instead of just surviving, hoping instead of despairing. "I need to tell you all something," Margaret began, her voice thick with emotion. "A year ago, I was sitting in a studio apartment with $17 and an eviction notice. I thought my life was over. I thought I had failed at everything that mattered. I was 73 years old and felt like I had nothing left to offer. But God taught me something profound. It's not about where you start. It's about who you follow and whether you're willing to obey. It's not about your age or your circumstances or your past. It's about your willingness to trust Him and take the next step He shows you." She held up her worn Bible, the same one she had opened that desperate morning. "Everything I taught you came from here. Not from business school, not from financial experts, not from self-help gurus. From the Word of God. Because the truth is, God is not just interested in your salvation, He's interested in your sanctification. And sanctification includes how you handle money, how you work, how you plan, how you give, how you trust. All of life is worship. Every dollar you budget is an act of worship. Every debt you pay is an act of worship. Every dollar you give is an act of worship. Because you're saying, God, I trust you. I believe your ways are better than my ways. I believe your word is true. The room was silent. Every woman was listening intently. Some were crying. All were nodding. The Reformed tradition I was raised in taught me something crucial, Margaret continued. It taught me that all of life is worship. Not just Sunday morning, not just prayer and Bible reading, but work, money, business, rest. All of it can be an offering to God. When you budget wisely, you're worshiping. When you pay off debt, you're worshiping. When you work with excellence, you're worshiping. When you give generously, you're worshiping. Because you're saying, God, I trust you. I believe your ways are better than my ways. I believe your word is true. She paused and looked around the room. So, here's what I want to ask you. What is God calling you to do with what you've learned? Because this isn't just about personal transformation. This is about kingdom expansion. Every one of you has a sphere of influence. Every one of you knows someone who is where you were a year ago, struggling, scared, hopeless, broke. What if you became the Margaret in their story? What if you taught them what you've learned? What if we multiplied this movement until every woman in Charleston, in South Carolina, in America, had access to biblical financial wisdom? The response was immediate. Women began volunteering to start groups in their neighborhoods, their churches, their workplaces. They wanted to teach what they had learned. They wanted to pass on the blessing. They wanted to be conduits, not containers. Margaret promised to support them, providing curriculum, training facilitators, offering guidance and prayer. Within 3 months, there were 8 satellite groups meeting across Charleston. The movement had taken on a life of its own. If you've made it this far in this story, thank you. Seriously, it means something to me that you're still here, that you're listening, that you care about substance and truth and transformation. Would you consider subscribing to this channel? We're building a community of people who want real stories with real wisdom. People who are tired of superficial content and hungry for something that actually matters. Join us. As 2026 approached, Margaret reflected on the astonishing journey of the past year, from eviction notice to national news, from $17 to thousands of dollars flowing through the Proverbs Fund, from shame to purpose, from victim to victor, from consumer to creator, from broken to blessed. The transformation was so complete, so thorough, that sometimes she had to remind herself it had only been a year. It felt like a lifetime. It felt like a resurrection. But the most profound change was internal. Margaret no longer feared poverty because she had learned that poverty is not about how much you have. It's about how much you trust God. She had been poor in resources but rich in faith, and she had watched God provide in ways she could never have orchestrated. She no longer feared aging because she had learned that God doesn't retire his servants. He refines them and redeploys them. 73 was not the end. It was a new beginning. She no longer feared failure because she had learned that in God's kingdom, failure is often the first step toward the greatest success. Her bankruptcy had been her breakthrough. Her collapse had been her catalyst. One of her favorite verses had become Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. Not some things, all things, even bankruptcy, even eviction notices, even the death of a spouse and the collapse of a business, even the shame and the fear and the desperate prayers at 3 in the morning. All things. God wastes nothing in the life of someone who trusts him. He redeems everything. He uses everything. He transforms everything. Margaret also learned something about the Reformed principle of providence, the doctrine that God sovereignly orchestrates all events for his glory and our good. Her financial collapse hadn't been a mistake or an oversight by a distracted deity. It had been a divine appointment, a strategic repositioning, a necessary demolition before a greater construction. God had been sovereignly working even in what felt like chaos. He had been directing her path even when she couldn't see the road. He had been writing her story even when the pen felt like it was crossing out chapter after chapter. The women in Margaret's group started calling themselves kingdom economists. They wore it as a badge of honor. They were women who had learned to think differently about money, to operate by different principles, to pursue different goals. They weren't trying to keep up with the Joneses. They were trying to keep up with Jesus, who had nowhere to lay his head, but who never lacked anything he needed, who gave everything away but who remains the richest man who ever lived, who taught that it's more blessed to give than to receive, that where your treasure is there your heart will be also, and that you cannot serve both God and money. In February 2025, Margaret received a letter that brought her to her knees. It was from a woman named Sarah in Ohio who had watched the news segment online. Sarah wrote, "Dear Margaret, I'm writing to tell you that you saved my life. 3 months ago, I was planning to end it all. I'm 68 years old. My husband left me for a younger woman after 42 years of marriage. I lost my job due to downsizing. I have no savings and no prospects. I felt like a burden to my children and a failure to God. I couldn't see any reason to keep living, but then I saw your story. I watched you talk about it never being too late. I heard you say God can write a new chapter, so I decided to try. I took the last $40 I had and started making the only thing I know how to make, quilts. My grandmother taught me when I was a little girl. I posted on Facebook that I was selling quilts for $40 each. I sold 3 the first week, then 5, then 10. I'm teaching quilting classes now at the community center, $15 per person, 6 people per class, 2 classes per week. I'm paying my rent. But more than that, I have a reason to wake up. I have hope again. I have purpose. My grandchildren are proud of me. I'm building something. Thank you for showing me that 68 is not the end. It can be a beginning. Thank you for teaching me that God still has plans for me. You saved my life, Margaret. Literally. And I'm telling everyone I know about kingdom economics. With all my gratitude, Sarah. Margaret wept over that letter. She had never met Sarah. They had never spoken. But God had used her story to save a life, to spark hope, to birth a new beginning. That's when she fully understood. This was never about her. It was about a God who specializes in resurrection, who makes all things new, who turns mourning into dancing and ashes into beauty. She was just the instrument, he was the composer. Now, as we close out this story, and as you close out this year, I want to leave you with some practical steps. If Margaret's story has inspired you, if you're ready for financial transformation rooted in faith, here's what you need to do. First, get honest about where you are. Write it down. Every debt, every asset, every dollar. You can't change what you won't acknowledge. Margaret started with $17. You start with what you have. No shame, no judgment, just honesty. Second, get biblical about where you're going. What does God's word say about money? Study it. There are over 2,000 verses about money and possessions in Scripture. God clearly thinks it's important. Read Proverbs, read Jesus, parables about money, read Paul's instructions about contentment and generosity. Let Scripture shape your financial worldview. Third, get practical about how you'll get there. Make a budget. Create a debt payoff plan. Start saving something, even if it's just $5 a week. Cut unnecessary expenses. Work extra hours if needed. Sell things you don't need. Do whatever it takes to get traction. Small steps matter. Faithfulness in little leads to responsibility in much. Fourth, get accountable. Tell someone your goals. Join a financial class at your church. Find a community of people who are on the same journey. You can't do this alone. You need encouragement, wisdom, challenge, and support. Find your Thursday night group. Fifth, get generous. Even in your lack, find someone with less and give something. Generosity breaks the spirit of poverty and invites God's blessing. Give to your church. Give to the poor. Give to kingdom work. Prove that God is your provider, not your money. And before you click away, I want to ask you one more time, where are you watching from? What's one thing you're taking away from Margaret's story? What's one change you're going to make in 2026? The comments are a place for community, for encouragement, for accountability. Let's use them. Share your story. Cheer someone else on. Let's build something beautiful together. Margaret is 74 now. She still bakes bread, though not as much since she trained others. She still teaches Kingdom Economics every Thursday night, though now it's streamed online for the satellite groups across Charleston and beyond. Women in other cities have asked to join, so they set up a virtual option. She still runs the Proverbs Fund, though it now has a board of directors and a growing endowment. Additional anonymous donors have contributed, inspired by the original gift. She still lives simply, in that same two-bedroom apartment, because she learned that contentment is not about having more, it's about wanting less and trusting more. When people ask her the secret to her transformation, she always gives the same answer. There is no secret. There's only Scripture, obedience, and a God who is faithful even when we are not. He took my brokenness and turned it into a blessing for others. He took my failure and turned it into a foundation for ministry. He took my ending and turned it into a beginning. That's what He does. That's who He is. And He'll do the same for you if you let Him. Margaret has a favorite quote now, though she can't remember where she first heard it. God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. She was not qualified to start a financial literacy ministry. She had just bankrupted herself. She was not qualified to run a micro-enterprise fund. She had never worked in banking or business development. She was not qualified to speak to thousands through viral videos. She had no media training or platform. But God called her, and in her obedience, He qualified her. He gave her wisdom beyond her education. He gave her favor beyond her credentials. He gave her impact beyond her imagination. Today, on the last day of 2025, so wherever you are in your financial journey, whatever you're facing, whatever you've lost or fear losing, remember Margaret. Remember that it's never too late. Remember that God's economy operates differently. Remember that faithfulness in small things leads to responsibility in large things. Remember that giving unlocks receiving. Remember that work is worship. Remember that contentment is wealth. Remember that what you steward matters more than what you accumulate. As you step into 2026, step with faith, step with wisdom, step with hope, step knowing that the same God who fed 5,000 with 5 loaves, who provided oil for a widow, who guided the Proverbs 31 woman, who transformed Margaret Whitmore, is ready and willing to guide you too. He's not done writing your story. The best chapter might still be ahead, but you have to trust Him with the pen. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Thank you for listening to Margaret's story. Thank you for being part of this community. If this blessed you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. If it challenged you, sit with that challenge and pray about it. And if it changed you, live differently because of it. That's how transformation spreads. One story, one person, one obedient step at a time. God bless you. Happy New Year. And may 2026 be the year your faith and your finances finally align according to God's perfect plan. Verse for your meditation. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct thy paths. Proverbs 3:5-6.